Welcome to Hey Sister. This is Season 2, Episode 4, Launching into Connection with Confidence. Hey Sister!
Hey sister!
Thanks for joining us. I'm Courtney Lewis.
And I'm Carly Ferguson. Welcome to our Sisterly Phone Call Inspired podcast.
Hop on our calls each week as we interview qualified guest experts and discuss the meaningful and sometimes mundane aspects of our lives.
We're so excited to connect with you, sister. Let's get talking.
We are excited to be joined by Tamara Lichfield for part 3 in this 3-series segment, preparing us to build connections in our daily lives. We've been so honored to have Tamara talk to us in the past 2 episodes about checking in with our own emotions and setting boundaries, as well as empathizing instead of sympathizing with others in last week's episode. We're excited to talk today with Tamara about finding our story, post-traumatic growth, and 4 agreements we can make with ourselves as we prepare to launch into the world and make connections with others around us. Tamara, we're excited to have you back with us today. Could you give a quick recap of who you are, a little bit about your life coaching experience, and what we're going to talk about today?
Okay, I am Tamara Lichfield, and I live in El Dorado Hills, California. I'm a wife, a mom of 3 children. I have an 18-year-old daughter, a 16-year-old son, and a 6-year-old daughter. I'm a flutist. I have a degree in music performance from University of the Pacific. I like to volunteer at my local elementary and help out in the band. Most recently, though, I am a life coach. I work at my business, Becoming Shatterproof, LLC, specializing guiding my clients through emotional trauma and teaching my clients healthy emotional skills to navigate relationships of all kinds. I have certifications as a certified trauma support specialist, and I am a certified partner coach candidate through APSATS, the Association of Partners of Sex Addicts Trauma Specialists, and most recently, I am a certified resiliency professional.
Wonderful. We know that you are the qualified person to talk to on this topic of launching into connections. And we've really enjoyed the advice and the insights that you've given us in the past 2 episodes. I'm wondering if you could give a quick overview of what we've talked about so that our sisters know what to go back and listen for in parts 1 and 2 of this series.
Okay, so part 1, we talked about some healthy communication styles, healthy communication behaviors that we can have. We talked about what to avoid. Again, what to avoid is the defensiveness, the stonewalling, the criticism, and the contempt. So we want to make sure that we avoid those. In the last episode, we just talked about codependency, sympathy versus empathy, and boundaries, all big topics that have been exciting to discuss with you. And I have really enjoyed your insights.
You've definitely opened our eyes a lot, and hopefully the eyes of all of our sisters, because Carly and I, as we've talked about in the first episode of this season, feel very confident that we want to focus on connection this season. So every month we'll be talking about connection within different aspects of our lives, whether it's your role as a mother or a friend, or maybe it's building connections when you're on vacation or in a workout class and you're making friends with people at the gym. We want to talk about connections over the next coming months, but we knew that before we could talk about how to build those connections, we really needed to understand how we can relate with others. And if we're at a point that we can actually make connections, what are triggers in our own life? What are boundaries we should be setting? Are we emotionally healthy enough to have these relationships? Like you've mentioned, what should we be avoiding? What should we be pursuing as we try to be the friend we want to have? So we're excited to have you with us today. And I think we've talked enough about these other areas, the emotional check-ins and the boundaries, that we're ready to spread our wings and fly. So talk to us a little bit today, Tamara, about how we can launch into this ability to have connections.
All right. Well, one of the first things I like to think of is, you mentioned it a little bit at the beginning, is what's your story? What is it that you want to communicate to the world? What is your passion? So by telling your story, and I mentioned this before, being fully known, you heal those wounded parts of yourself, and it can be a transformative experience. So as a trauma coach, I help guide people through the muck, just the absolute muck of emotional trauma. And the goal of all of this is post-traumatic growth, where they realize an untapped potential for things greater within themselves that didn't exist before the trauma. The best part is they determine what their passion will be. And you can find yourself in areas within your sphere of influence where you have opportunities to make new and powerful connections. And sometimes this requires stepping out of your comfort zone and expanding your window of tolerance for uncomfortability. This can require baby steps, and sometimes this requires giant leaps. As we learn through practice, not every bid for connection will have the outcome we may desire. So self-compassion is essential here as we grow ourselves, no matter what age we may be. None of us have reached perfection, so there is always room for personal growth. Now that we understand some basic emotional tools, I recommend reading a book by Miguel Ruiz. It's called The 4 Agreements. So the 4 agreements, to start off with, are agreement 1, be impeccable with your word. Agreement 2, don't take anything personally. Agreement 3, don't make assumptions. And agreement 4, always do your best. So agreement 1, it talks about being impeccable with your word. Essentially, it means always tell the truth. Always do what you say you're going to do. Also, choose your words wisely. Say what you mean and do so with clarity and intent. Basically, with this one, I think it means a lot about letting integrity be your standard. Be impeccable with your word. So then agreement 2, don't take anything personally. A little summary of that is recognize that most of the time, people are doing the best they can with their circumstances. They are reacting or responding based on their past experiences and or trauma. So we can't take anything personally. I mentioned in previous episodes, we don't know the backstory, so you can't take it personally.
I know you want to go on to the other points here, the 3 and 4 that you've mentioned, but I have to say with this point, the don't take anything personally, that is really important for us to do. But I think if you're hearing this and you're like, oh, but I do take things personally when somebody hurts me, that goes back to part 2, where we've talked about boundaries and what you can do to set a realistic boundary for situations when something hurts and you might want to take it personally, but let it roll off. Set your boundary. That way you don't take it personally.
Good point. Thank you, Courtney.
And like you said in last episode too, was that their intent may not always be to harm. And so if you're at least having this don't take anything personality as your reaction to it, where you're thinking through, they are probably going through something. This is not something because of me. I think that just helps disassociate the emotional connection to what they've done, at least enough to let you feel like you're not the cause. That's just a healthier way to feel about it than sometimes when we can tell ourselves that it's our fault or they were trying to hurt our feelings. And it's hardest thing to do probably is to not take it personally, but at least having something guarding yourself from immediately taking it personally.
I like all those points that you just mentioned. And when you were talking about that, it brought up some other things in my mind about this. So I think that there is an important distinction between intent versus impact. So someone might not intend to hurt someone, but the impact that their actions had on someone could be greater and more damaging than what the intent was, partly because of what I've talked about before is we don't know the backstory. There could be a trigger attached to the behavior that causes the impact for the other person to just about explode. And so that's why we have this agreement is don't take anything personally. The other thing I wanted to bring up that goes along with this is positive self-talk. If we catch ourselves to having negative self-talk, like, oh no, I can't do anything right. No wonder that happened, or no wonder they did that. It's because I'm not good enough, or I'm less than, or whatever it is. If you start going down this spiral of negative self-talk, then it's self-defeating and it feeds that cycle of taking everything personally. So if you can have positive self-talk and reverse the negative self-talk, then that is a healthier emotional behavior to choose.
I like that point, especially when you consider having a positive self-talk and recognizing it before you start spiraling down a negative thought, because a lot of times things that you take personally, you're taking them personally because that's a vulnerable area for you. I have an example that comes to my mind that I'll share, and hopefully the person who said this to me doesn't listen. But several years ago, I had a friend who hadn't seen me through the pandemic, and I was pregnant at the time with my youngest. And so after not seeing me for 6 months, she saw me and I was knocking on the due date's door. And she said something to me about my weight, that I'd gotten huge. She's like, oh, you really found the COVID-20 or something along those lines. She was trying to be funny, but it kind of hurt because I was like, I'm pregnant. So it really shouldn't have hurt because you're pregnant. So obviously you put on the COVID-20, like that joke. Everybody's like, you've put on the COVID-20. But I also realized that that comment was not necessarily uplifting, and it did have an impact on me. Like I remember hearing it and being offended, honestly. And I took it personally, which I shouldn't have. But looking back, I should have reflected and realized she was saying that for who knows what reason. She wasn't intending to hurt me. This is a friend of mine. But it was just kind of an interesting comment to have somebody make it, and to realize, okay, there might have been something going on in her life that day that she felt the need to comment on somebody else's weight, or it could have just been a completely thoughtless comment. You know, you don't know somebody's intent, but it's on you to decide whether or not to take a comment personally, or whether or not to let it be water off a duck's back. Just let it roll.
Good example. I like that a lot. So the third agreement is don't make assumptions. And I personally think this is the one that a lot of people can fall into the trap of doing, is making assumptions. It's best to know the facts and not to assume anything about how someone is feeling, especially. This is where we make up stories in our head, and that's called cognitive fusion. It's when you assume something, then you make up a story behind the assumption, then your brain believes your story, and the trouble is, it may or may not be true. So the best path forward here is to ask curiosity questions and gently find out how someone is feeling about whatever it is that the issue or concern is, instead of assuming. Because when we assume, it can be very harmful. We can think we know what is going on, and it can actually damage the relationship when you assume, especially if you're going to assume the worst.
Do you feel like that would lead into that contempt a little bit? Because I know I watch a movie and I like when I feel like I know what's going to happen, or I feel like I can tell that character, whatever, you know. And I think we get a little like
Self-proclaimed detective.
Yeah, we feel like social detectives of, are they trying to say this? And like, did that come from this place? And it's more self-defeating, I think, than anything, because most of the time you make yourself the victim in those situations of what they've said. Or going back to number 2, right, with the taking things personally and assuming the intent behind something, which is really just telling ourselves that they are this kind of person. And I like how you called it cognitive fusion. Is that right?
Yep.
And yeah, it makes you feel like you have this understanding, this knowledge, like one up, you know, you saw through this, whatever experience that they did this thing and it made you feel bad, and you can see through that. And it makes you feel a little smarter, but it can also lead to even more hurt, because if they didn't intend that really, then you're taking their character and just running it through the dirt, or taking this one experience and saying, I'm going to, because you hurt my feelings, define you by this whole thing, which is not fair to that other person either, because you don't know what they're going through. And I think we've all been in the situation where we've said something and accidentally had it come out wrong or something. And we should all strive to be like mindful of that and always apologizing. But it takes a lot. And I think it's really good that is an agreement that you're going to try to consciously make.
Yes.
It does take work to do that. It doesn't just come naturally. Well, maybe for some it does. I think that there are those, like my husband is one, that does not assume with other people and what they might be thinking. It has to be very clearly said. And if not, then it doesn't really affect him that way. And I love that. I think it's been really good for me to like hear him and his take on things. I like to try to use them as a good sounding board for myself in times because of that.
I'm glad to hear Carley say that about her husband. And I think there's probably a lot of people that can relate to that on a like Mars Venus level, where the man sees things as they are. They're clear, needs to be clearly said. I guess my question for you would be, Tamara, if I make an assumption that allows me to give somebody more grace, is that kind of assumption okay? Or is that still damaging?
I believe that's okay. And I think in some things, I believe it's good to use your intuition.
Okay.
I generally assume if I'm in a healthy place emotionally, that people are doing the best they can with what they have, with their experiences they have, with what they've been given. If you can indulge me for a moment, I'm going to talk a little bit about what I do with my work and how this relates.
Yes, please.
If there's been trauma, relational trauma in the mix, it's very common for someone who has experienced trauma to make assumptions that are negative, that believe the worst.
Yeah.
And the reason for this is because their assumptive reality has been shattered by their primary attachment figure. Okay. So I use some big words there. Assumptive reality is basically when you assume the reality you're living is true and safe and rainbows and roses and all happiness, and that you have a secure attachment there.
And probably that everybody else's life is like that too, right?
Yes. And so then when relational trauma enters the picture, then because your reality's been shattered, and often it can be the primary attachment figure that has shattered it, so to speak, then it is very, very common to believe the worst while you are in that shattering, especially that first stage of trauma. But I do want to add this. It is possible to heal. And once you get to post-traumatic growth, then you no longer have that pessimistic view of things and you don't make those negative assumptions again. And it is possible to heal.
That's good to hear.
And it is so good for us to be conscious that we're not just like having that tendency to assume. Because I think if you've ever had the experience when someone doesn't like you and you don't know why,
yeah,
it's probably something to that extent where they're defending themselves because they've had an experience, maybe with someone like you. And so they don't trust you and they're making that distrust be a little harsh, a little obvious. And it can really hurt to feel like you have been labeled by someone or you didn't know why. And so it is really good not to have those, because those assumptions that I'm not going to say it, but the adage, when you assume you make, a
donkey of you and
me, right? I heard that when I was a kid. And even though it was like not the appropriate thing to say at church, it did go in my mind. And I'm like, it's true though. It's quite true that by putting something out there at somebody else, you're really just pointing the other four fingers back at you. So just being aware of that is good.
It is.
Love
Tamara, I think we cut you off though before you could even get to agreement 4. I mean, I think we could talk about assuming all day because it is a great topic.
Yes, I think it's the biggest one. We can fall into that trap pretty easily. Yeah, agreement 4 is always do your best at whatever you're pursuing. Always give it your best effort and realize that some days your best is going to look different than another day. Do your best for that day. Stay in the present. Don't judge yourself too harshly. Have self-compassion and be determined to do a little better the next day. Always do your best.
I love that. I think that goes back to another old adage, which is step outside your comfort zone.
No growth outside the comfort zone.
Yes, no growth outside the comfort zone. In college, somebody told me it was outside of the comfort zone, you step into the miracle zone.
There's no growth in the comfort zone. Sorry.
Sorry, is that it?
Yeah.
Cassidy's told me that before too. There's no growth in a comfort zone and there's no comfort in a growth zone, I think is how Cassidy has said it before, our youngest sister. So you can chew on that.
No comfort. Maybe a little bit of comfort.
I love your accent.
Hug your teddy bear. It doesn't have to be a cold world.
Well, it kind of is. It's a cold, harsh world, and everybody's making assumptions. And we all need to grow and step outside our comfort zone. But I think that goes back to do your best, step outside your comfort zone in a little bit every day. Do a little bit better than you did the day before, which is sometimes contrary to what you hear when we live in a world that's like, you do you, don't push yourself too hard, don't add any stress to your life. And we know that actually stress can be good. It can be helpful. We need to work through things and do hard things and gain the pride and satisfaction that comes from growth. So I appreciate that you've brought that up of always do your best, because sometimes I wonder if we cut ourselves too much slack in building connections with others, that we feel like, I don't want to make a friend. I don't want to step outside my comfort zone. I don't want to go to this party I was invited to. I don't want to have a face-to-face conversation. And so you end up retreating, because we live in a world that you can be making connections all the time, but it's all too common that people, I mean, maybe this is me assuming, but people step back from things, and post-pandemic, it's at an all-time high that people are suffering with loneliness. And this is the time when we need to be making connections more than ever, with not just other friends, but with our families, with God, within ourselves, really connecting to our spirit. So I've been really grateful for all the advice you've given us over the past 3 episodes.
Well, I was going to say too to that, because we're talking about connection. And I think it's easy when we feel like we are hurt mentally, emotionally, or just not feeling like we're connecting with people. I really love that 4th agreement, always do your best. It seems like such an obvious thing, but I think if you're feeling self-defeating, those thoughts, or like you're taking the low-hanging fruit of you're not doing well today, you're not able to go to that party because you're not going to make any friends anyways. And those are the things that come up. So it's not an intentional, I just don't want to go. Sometimes it's I feel like I can't because already I've stopped myself. And so being willing to do your best is actually a big step. Is a lot of motion that has to be made mentally to be able to say, I'm going to raise the bar for myself with this because I know I can. And so it's like, you can do it, and you can make connections. You can reconnect to people. And so with all of this, if you've learned from these things, if you are able to set those boundaries and understand what healthy communication, like all these wonderful things that Tamara's been talking to us about, then you can reconnect and begin growing. Even if it's from the very beginning, that's okay. If you want to have one more friend, you can just take it in those steps. It is a wonderful thing that we are blessed to have. And I think as we've talked about all of these things, I think to our Savior, Jesus Christ, who is the perfect example of not making assumptions or not taking something personally when he had every right to.
And being impeccable with his word.
Being impeccable with his word. He is the word. And like doing his best. It was perfect. Come on, 4 for 4. But he made it all. So it's really important to know that like he's rooting for us in all of this. And I'm grateful for that. Thank you, Tamara. Was there anything else that you could add or sum up for us?
Well, I think you did a beautiful job of summing it all up.
She really did. That was great, Car.
Yeah, you tied that up in a bow.
I've just been feeling it. Like this is so empowering. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us.
Oh, you're welcome.
So, Tamara, as you said, Carly did wrap it up nicely with a bow. But we know that you have so much more you could talk on any of these topics about. In fact, I wish I had a counter for how many times I thought, oh, I need to ask a follow-up question on this or on that. Or if you were like, well, that would be a whole nother podcast episode. I'm like, yes, definitely. So I know there's so many topics within this whole series that we've addressed that we could elaborate further on. So if our sisters want to connect with you more for elaboration, where can they find you? And could you talk a little bit more about what you do?
Oh, yes. Find me at becomingshatterproof@gmail.com or on Facebook at Becoming Shatterproof, and at my website, becomingshatterproof.us. I am a life coach. I help people do a lot of things in their life. So sometimes I help them just organize some thoughts around something that's important that's coming up. Sometimes I help them just learn resilience skills. Sometimes I help them move through trauma. Sometimes I give them some information, psychoed about trauma or about emotions or about resilience, and give them opportunities to do some introspection, some work, doing some figuring out their values, figuring out their boundaries, helping them learn healthy emotional skills to help them in their lives and in their relationships, which builds connection.
Wonderful. And you do this virtually, right?
Yes, I do this virtually or on the phone, and I can do it here locally too in El Dorado Hills.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again for joining us, Tamara, for all this wonderful information today, as well as the information in the past 2 parts of this 3-part segment. Sisters, as you know from season 1, we usually end our episodes with a doable call to action we invite everyone to take part in. But for this 3-part series, we've decided not to offer a call to action and just let you chew on the topics that we've talked about and find what it is that you want to work on with your own personal life. We hope you found helpful info in today's episode, as well as in parts 1 and 2 of the series. And if you haven't listened to those episodes yet, go give those a listen because they are golden. And collectively, they have prepared us to launch ourselves confidently into social situations. So come back and join us next Monday and for all of season 2 from here on out, as we host various guests to talk to us about specific relationships and creative ways to strengthen connections in the opportunistic life of a woman, where a friendship is potentially around every corner. And until then, remember to connect with us on Instagram or Facebook, search for the Hey Sister podcast, and we'd love to connect with you there. Also, check out our show notes for any references shared today, including Tamara's Facebook page and the book she mentioned earlier, as well as a minute marker timeline if you want to jump back to a particular section of today's call. Thanks again for joining us, Tamara. And sisters, thanks as always for joining us for our Straight Talkin' Sisterly call. We'll talk to y'all next week. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. I was going to say Tamara Lichfield. Okay,
Tamara
I was going to say linchpin. That was what was going to come out of my mouth. And so that's why I stopped myself.
She is the linchpin.
I was like, this is with the 3rd segment with, and then I stopped because I was like, I don't think linchpin is right. Okay.